Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Josh Gladstone, and I'm a doctoral student at Carleton University studying with this wonderful group of graduate students and Francis Abel as well as our supervisor. And I'm here I'm coming in towards the end of the Socio-Economic research. And I'm very pleased and thankful that I'm here to talk about how my research interests, as I'm just at the beginning of my dissertation, how my research interests are related to and are benefiting from the work that's been done through Socio-Economic to date. So I'm hoping to touch on some of the work that's been done at Socio-Economic, but also talk about how that relates to my own work. So thanks to Val and Chris and Francis and David Natcher and Brenna for having me here. I'm really excited about this project, what I'm hoping to do. But before I begin, I thought I might start with a bit of an introduction to me, who I am, because I haven't been a part of this to date. So maybe with the next slide. I could just tell you very briefly about how I got here. I grew up in Toronto. I became a geologist. I worked for mining companies and resource development companies, gold mining companies for a number of years before finding that a lot of my own questions that came up through that work weren't being answered by that sector, and those questions were how do people fit into the equation, and all of this resource development that has been going on and that I was a part of at the very grassroots level. How does that fit with the local agenda? And being from Toronto, I really didn't have the answer to that, and so I made a transition to working up north in communities on issues that I thought were important. So I moved to Cambridge Bay and worked for the Nunavut Impact Review Board for a period, and then moved to the government of Nunavut, where I worked for the Department of Executive and Intergovernmental Affairs before moving on to work with NTI, Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated. Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, when I was there, they were looking at comprehensive land claims agreements in the implementation division of that organization. And David Kunuk, who was the director there, was really interested in how to look at comprehensive land claims evaluation in a holistic way, what the relationship between the land claim in Nunavut, oh, move it closer, sorry, can people hear me better now? I'm sorry about that. How comprehensive land claims agreements can be evaluated and understood within a broader social and economic context. So with that in mind, we can move to the next slide. I started thinking about, how can we understand this question? How are comprehensive land claims agreements affecting change in the northern social economy? And they're really, to me, this is a really interesting question for a number of reasons. One, because there are 11 comprehensive land claims agreements settled in northern Canada. Roughly 40% of Canada's land mass is covered by a comprehensive land claim. They represent about $2.5 billion in capital transfers, and they are meant to support the political and economic self-determination of 92,000 beneficiaries in northern Canada. So these are really significant agreements, and they have a whole bunch of things that go along with them. They have a bureaucracy, they restructure the economy, so there's a whole bunch of financial capital that comes through these agreements. For instance, the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, it was settled with a $1.17 billion cash injection into a trust. And then there's the land ownership regime, land management regime, employment provisions, business contracting, and then provisions for wildlife harvesting. So at this point, land claims, the first one in the north was settled in 1984, at least the territorial north. That was Inuvialuit Regional, the Inuvialuit Final Agreement. And then Nunavut in 1993. And we're really just beginning to understand how these agreements are impacting things at a sort of a regional economic level and restructuring how decisions are made and how economies are reproduced. So I think understanding how these processes happen and how things are changing is really important. It's important for Northerners, particularly Inuit, because this is their land claim, their money, their political organizations, and they need to know what's happening, how money's being invested, how other resources are being invested, and how the economy is being changed and how that might affect their livelihoods. And this is a question for democratic development. If we don't understand what's happening, how do we make decisions? And then for the South, for Southerners, and also sort of non-Inuit in Nunavut, how do we support that agenda, whatever that agenda has to be? And how do we contribute to socioeconomic development? We need information about how these land claims are functioning in order to, I guess, develop good policy. So that's my interest, is understanding policy development and how it's changed or remained the same under comprehensive land claims agreements. So the next slide is really just this one, you have to click. Oh yeah, okay. So this is all of the ways that we talk about the northern the economy in the north and the social economy. And this slide, really, the point was for me to just explain that I guess I see this as the social economy includes the land-based and what we call the capitalist or the wage-based economy, and that in the history of policymaking in the north, these two, there's been quite a bit of tension, and I think we all understand what that tension is between sort of subsistence harvesting and wage labor, and what that means perhaps at the sort of level of how people make their living. But it's also, I think as David Natcher wrote in one of his papers, that this is the way that, it's not just the way that people make a living, it's the way that social values are transmitted, and that's different sort of from culture to culture and nation to nation. So keeping that in mind, then, how is policy formed under a land claim in a land claim jurisdiction, and how has that changed over the time when there wasn't a land claim? So I guess very quickly I'm going to just sort of go through a couple of slides about what things were like perhaps way back when, and then what things are like now. And I'll do that quickly because I feel like I might be running out of time. These are one's a sort of a reproduction of a letter written to the Eskimo people by a government bureaucrat in 1931. And it talks about, it says that your food, your winter clothing, your dog food all come from your country, either from the sea or from the land. There is no other way to get them, is what this says. And it was written for the benefit of the Eskimo people. But it represents a time, I think, when the land-based economy was seen as separate, and where there were relationships between how people made a living off the land and sort of use some of those resources to secure what they needed in order to continue to reproduce that economy. But then, that was at a time when the economy was seen as sort of separate in policy. But later on, as industrialization began, Southerners sort of the policy that was developed reflected this idea that the land-based economy would die out. So even if we look at sort of the Berger inquiry and how that was happening in the Northwest Territories, there's a quote, and he says that we have assumed that the native economy is moribund and that the native people should therefore be induced to enter industrial wage employment. But I found that income in kind from hunting, fishing, and trapping is far more important in the northern economy than we had thought. So he's sort of, in some ways, he's probably stating the obvious for people that lived in the north, but in terms of the effect that that had on policy, perhaps, and this is sort of a sketch, right? I'm still at the beginning of my research, but this is sort of the entrance of the mixed economy into real public policy debate, and it factored into the decision that was made in the Mackenzie Valley pipeline inquiry. So at that same time, land claims were coming onto the scene, and people thought that land claims would give people the opportunity to control their political and economic futures. So then you might want to ask, well, then how has policy changed as a result of that? So with the next slide, I guess in 2001, when Nunavut was formed, a group decided that they wanted to understand a little bit more about how the Nunavut economy was functioning. It had just separated from the NWT's economy, at least in a jurisdictional way. And so this series of reports has been produced since 2001, and they provide, it's a source of information about economic change in the territory on a sector-by-sector basis. And at the same time, it provides advice bordering on prescription about how economic development ought to take place in the territory. And what's funny is that you still sort of find these same ideas about progress, about how the land-based economy will eventually, it might not die out, but really we need to be investing in the wage-based economy because that's where all these opportunities for growth are. So the focus of economic development policy really ought to be on the wage-based economy, so on the capitalist economy. And that Aboriginal people, it actually talks about sort of the structural transition, that we have this new economy and it's imposed on the old economy, and that people will sort of move from one economy to the other over time, and eventually, well, maybe the land-based economy will still be there, maybe not, but really we're going to focus on the wage-based economy and on capitalism. But they also recognize, and it's sort of funny at this time, these reports recognize that government policy can affect the rate of transition, maybe not the direction of transition. I don't think anybody's talking about going backwards, but government policy can affect the rate of transition. What they don't really talk about in the report, though, is how land claims agreements and the organizations that are formed under those agreements might affect the rate of transition. So I don't know if anybody saw the Up Here Business magazine. If you're at the Explorer and you opened one of your drawers, you might have found it. I always go for the drawers. There's interesting stuff in there sometimes. But there's a lot on mining in here, and one of them is the race is on mining and rare earths, and that's on page 36. And this is all about how I know this is an issue at this point, how the land regime, the regulatory regime in the Mackenzie Valley is really too slow for mining companies that need quick access to their permit so that they can get on board with the next trend in mining and minerals. And there's been a drive to sort of reduce regulatory duplication and create efficiency in the regulatory system. Well, this is sort of an example of how people are seeing the rate of transition in some respects. And in policy, we see how the government is responding to that, which is by creating commissions to figure out how to make things go faster. So I think we understand the government's trying to do that, but we don't really have a sense of how, at least in Nunavut, how Inuit organizations are, I guess Inuit organizations, land claims organizations are a part of that picture, and not just through the regulatory boards, but through the whole system that's set up. And understanding that, for me, it's an interesting question, but it seems like, through the work that I've done with NTI, it seems like this is becoming a question for some of the organizations themselves. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I think basically what I need to do is just spell out really, what do I want to do, and this is something I have to sort through in the next year, and I'm really interested in hearing your feedback on this if anybody's interested in it also. In the next slide, if my questions are, if comprehensive land claims agreements are influencing the direction of socioeconomic change, how do they do this? What is the process? how is the economy being restructured? And that means focusing on who and then on what the institutions are that are allowing who to do what. Pretty straightforward, I guess. And then, so is there a coherent strategy for the Inuit sphere? If Inuit are leading economic development, and in many ways I think Inuit are leading economic development in Nunavut at least, what's the strategy? What's the investment focus? If there are resources coming into these organizations, are they going to be investing where government is investing, or are they going to be investing in areas where government isn't investing? And those kinds of questions are really important, considering just how much resources these organizations have. These are really key questions that need to be answered. And then, we could see some of this in how organizations are committing their resources, but then also how they're advocating the government in its policy process. And then thirdly, does Inuit involvement in policymaking reflect a new economic development philosophy? So if we go back in time and we look at how this philosophy is represented in some of the historical documentation we have, and then we look to today, what has the philosophy changed? How do people see this process? And I think that's an important question to answer. So that's me, that's what my interests are, and I think this has some bearing on the social economy, although probably at like a very regional policy level. And yeah, I'd really like to talk to people about this if they have any questions or comments. So thank you.